On Melrose Avenue, tucked between an old record store and a flickering neon diner sign, stood the Velvet Note, a jazz club that had seen decades of stories unfold. The kind of place where time seemed to pause, where every note played carried the weight of someone's joy or heartbreak. It was more than a club. It was a haven for dreamers, wanderers, and those who found solace in the smoky haze of music that spoke the words they couldn't. It was a place where strangers exchanged glances across smoky tables, and conversations were carried on the current of a melody. Sam had worked at the club for years, mastering the art of being present without being seen. His movements were precise, almost meditative, as he wiped down the bar and arranged glasses. The regulars had come to trust him, not just with their drink orders, but with their unspoken stories. They knew he'd listen without judgment, offering a small smile or a knowing nod in return. But Sam rarely shared anything of his own. His past was a closed chapter, one he kept locked away behind a cool demeanor and practiced routines. Across town, Jasper had spent the day wandering the familiar streets of Melrose Avenue, guitar case slung over his shoulder. The musician was a regular at small venues like the Velvet Note, chasing gigs that paid just enough to keep his dream alive. He had charisma, the kind that drew people in, but behind the charm was a man carrying his own quiet loneliness. Jasper's life was a series of almosts, almost getting signed, almost making it big. Music was his passion, but the relentless pursuit of success often left him questioning whether it was worth the cost. That night, the two men's worlds were destined to intersect. Jasper arrived at the Velvet Note with his usual air of confidence, though his eyes carried the weight of a long day. He greeted the doorman with a nod, exchanged a few words with the saxophonist warming up on stage, and made his way to the bar. Sam noticed him immediately. New faces weren't unusual, but there was something different about this one. Jasper's presence seemed to command attention, though not in an overbearing way. He had a quiet intensity, the kind that left an impression. Jasper leaned against the bar, setting his guitar case down carefully at his feet. "Whiskey neat," he said, his voice carrying the faint rasp of someone who lived his life on stage. Sam nodded, reaching for a glass without saying a word. As he poured the drink, he felt Jasper's gaze on him. Not intrusive, but curious. Sam placed the glass on the bar, their eyes meeting briefly as he slid it across. "Thanks," Jasper said, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sam nodded again, his expression unreadable, and turned his attention back to the bar. He had no intention of engaging further. People came and went, and Sam preferred it that way. But Jasper lingered, taking a slow sip of his drink as he surveyed the room. The quiet hum of conversation mixed with the warm tones of a saxophone solo. Jasper's fingers tapped lightly against his glass, as though keeping time with the music. The evening carried on, with Sam watching from the corner of his eye as Jasper moved to a seat near the stage. The musician's demeanor changed as soon as he opened his guitar case. His focus sharpened, and the air around him seemed to shift. When Jasper finally stepped onto the small stage, the room fell into a hush. He adjusted the microphone, strummed a few chords to test the tuning, and then began to play. The melody was raw, soulful, and carried a vulnerability that caught even Sam off guard. It wasn't just music, it was a story told through each note, a glimpse into the parts of Jasper he didn't let show. From behind the bar, Sam found himself watching more closely than he intended, his usual indifference slipping away. There was something about the way Jasper played, the way he poured himself into the performance, that struck a chord Sam didn't expect. And then it happened. A moment so brief it could have been missed. As Jasper finished his set, his eyes met Sam's once more. There was no smile this time, just a quiet exchange, a flicker of recognition that neither man could fully understand in that moment. Jasper's performances became a regular feature, each set carrying the same raw intensity that had captured the room on his first night. Patrons began to remember his name, humming his melodies long after they'd left. Yet, for Jasper, the applause felt fleeting, a momentary distraction from the larger struggles looming in his life. One late evening, after the last customer had slipped out into the Los Angeles night, Jasper remained at the bar, strumming his guitar softly. Sam, wiping down the counter, didn't look up, though he was well aware of the musician's lingering presence. You know, Jasper began, his voice casual but edged with curiosity. You're probably the quietest bartender I've ever met. Most of the guys behind bars like this can't stop talking. Sam glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. I hear enough talking during the rush. The quiet's nice. Jasper chuckled, leaning back in his seat. Fair enough. But you've got to have a story. Everyone does. Sam didn't answer. Instead, he continued cleaning, his movements methodical, almost as if trying to shut out the conversation. Jasper, however, wasn't one to be easily deterred. Okay, no stories then, Jasper said, strumming a few notes. How about music? You've got to like jazz if you work here. That question, though seemingly simple, caught Sam off guard. He paused for a moment before replying. I like it well enough. Jasper raised an eyebrow. Well enough? Come on, a place like this doesn't just hire someone who likes it well enough. You've got to feel it. The corners of Sam's mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly, as he placed the last glass back on the rack. I used to play, he said finally, his voice low. Jasper's strumming stopped, and he leaned forward slightly. Play what? Piano, Sam admitted, though his tone suggested he wished he hadn't. No kidding? Jasper said, his curiosity sparking. Why don't you anymore? Sam's response was a shrug, but the silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid. Jasper let it hang for a moment before changing the subject, sensing he'd pushed as far as Sam would let him, for now. Over the next few weeks, Jasper made it a habit to linger after his gigs, sharing snippets of his life with Sam. He spoke of the first time he picked up a guitar, the nights he spent in tiny clubs like the Velvet Note, and his dreams of signing with a label that understood his music. Sam listened, offering the occasional nod or question, though he remained guarded about his own life. One night, Jasper's usual upbeat energy was noticeably dimmed. He ordered a whiskey and sat silently, his guitar case unopened beside him. Tough crowd? Sam asked, surprising even himself by initiating the conversation. Jasper let out a dry laugh. Tough week. Got a call back from that label I've been chasing, but they passed. Said my sound wasn't commercial enough. He shook his head, staring into his glass. Feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. For a moment, Sam didn't reply. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, Your sound's good. Better than good. If they can't see that, it's their loss. Jasper looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Well, that's probably the nicest thing you've said to me since I got here. Sam's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles before he turned away, but Jasper caught it. As the weeks went on, Jasper's persistence began to wear down Sam's walls. The bartender found himself opening up in ways he hadn't for years, sharing pieces of his past he'd kept buried. He told Jasper about growing up in a small town outside Bakersfield, how he'd spent hours at the piano as a kid, and how music had once been everything to him. He didn't mention why he'd stopped playing, but the way his voice trailed off hinted at a pain Jasper didn't press him on. At least, not yet. Their growing connection, however, wasn't without its challenges. One evening, after a particularly lively set, Jasper leaned against the bar, his grin teasing. You know, you're a tough nut to crack, Sam, but I think I'm making progress. Sam rolled his eyes, but didn't reply. Jasper pushed a little further. What's it going to take to get a real smile out of you? Should I write you a song? Dedicate my next set to the mysterious bartender with a killer poker face? Sam's expression darkened, the light humor evaporating. Don't, he said, his voice sharper than Jasper had ever heard it. Jasper blinked, taken aback. Hey, I was just kidding. Well, don't, Sam snapped, turning away. The tension was thick as Jasper set his glass down and stood. You know, for someone who likes to listen, you're pretty good at shutting people out. His words hung in the air, stinging both of them. Without another word, he grabbed his guitar case and walked out, leaving Sam alone with the quiet hum of the club. The fallout lingered, both men wrestling with their own fears and insecurities. Jasper couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't enough, not as a musician, not as someone trying to connect with Sam. And Sam, haunted by the betrayal that had broken him before, couldn't bring himself to risk letting someone in again. Jasper leaned casually on the bar, strumming his guitar in soft, unhurried strokes. Sam, as usual, was tidying up, his hands moving over the counter with the precision of someone who found comfort in routine. But tonight, Jasper wasn't content to let the silence stretch. "So, you play piano?" Jasper said, his tone light but insistent. Sam glanced up briefly, the guarded look in his eyes returning. "I used to." Jasper set his guitar down, his expression warm but determined. "Used to isn't good enough. The piano's right there." He nodded toward the stage, where the instrument sat under the dim glow, waiting as if it had been left there just for this moment. Sam hesitated, his hands stilling. "It's been a long time, so..." "Music doesn't forget," Jasper replied with a grin. "Come on, I'll even play with you." For a moment, Sam didn't move. Then, almost reluctantly, he sighed and walked toward the stage. Jasper followed, his guitar in hand, as they both settled into place, Sam at the piano, Jasper on a stool beside him. Sam's fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain, but as Jasper began to strum a familiar melody, something shifted. The first note was hesitant, the second more assured, and soon the room was filled with a duet that seemed to tell a story all its own. It wasn't just music, it was a conversation, one without words, where every chord and note carried something deeper. Jasper's playful strumming coaxed Sam's cautious melodies into something more confident, more alive. The two of them were completely in sync, their shared passion weaving together in a way that felt effortless and pure. When the last note faded into silence, the two men sat there for a moment, the room heavy with something neither of them could quite name. Jasper set his guitar down, leaning slightly towards Sam, his voice soft. "See, told you music doesn't forget." Sam turned to look at him, his defenses lower than they'd ever been. "Maybe," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It was then, in the quiet, that something unspoken passed between them. Jasper leaned closer, closing the space between them. It wasn't planned or rehearsed, just a spontaneous, tentative kiss that seemed to contain all the vulnerability they'd both been hiding. When they pulled apart, neither spoke right away, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was warm, filled with a kind of understanding that words couldn't capture. Over the next few days, something between them changed. It wasn't a grand announcement or a sudden shift, but in the little moments, it became clear that the walls Sam had spent years building were starting to come down. One evening, during a crowded set at the Velvet Note, Jasper stepped up to the microphone, a confident glint in his eye. "This next song is for someone who didn't know they needed to hear it," he said, his gaze landing on Sam, who was watching from behind the bar. The melody was simple but beautiful, and as Jasper played, it was clear to everyone in the room that this wasn't just a song. It was a story. A story of quiet strength, of finding light in unexpected places, of the kind of connection that sneaks up on you and stays. Sam stood frozen, his heart pounding as the lyrics unfolded like a letter meant just for him. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen. Not just for who he was, but for the person he could be. Later that night, after the crowd had thinned and the music had faded, Sam approached Jasper, his voice unsteady. "That song, it was beautiful." Jasper grinned, his usual charm softened by something deeper. "It's what you do to me, Sam." Sam didn't reply right away, but his expression said everything Jasper needed to know. Slowly, carefully, Sam began to share more of himself. Not just the safe parts, but the pieces he'd hidden for so long. He spoke about the betrayal that had left him guarded, the dreams he'd given up on, and the fear that had kept him from reaching for more. Jasper listened, never interrupting, his presence steady and grounding. When Sam finally finished, Jasper reached for his hand, his grip firm but gentle. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Jasper said simply. And for the first time in years, Sam believed him. Life has a way of testing even the strongest connections, And for Sam and Jasper, that test arrived in the form of an opportunity that seemed too good to refuse. It started with a phone call, an offer for Jasper to join a prestigious touring jazz group, one that would take him across the country, performing in venues far larger than the Velvet Note. Jasper was stunned at first, overwhelmed by the validation he had been chasing for years. But the excitement was quickly tempered by the weight of what this could mean for his relationship with Sam. The thought of leaving Los Angeles, of leaving him, hung heavy in his mind, even as he rehearsed how to break the news. The conversation happened late one night, the two of them sitting at a small table in the club after hours. Jasper's voice was careful, measured, as he explained the offer. He spoke of the doors this could open, the chance to finally bring his music to a wider audience. But as he spoke, he noticed the shift in Sam's demeanor, the way his shoulders tensed, his gaze dropped to the floor. "So, you're leaving," Sam said quietly, his tone flat. Jasper frowned, leaning forward. "I didn't say that. I haven't even decided yet." "But you're considering it," Sam replied, his voice sharper now. "That's enough." Jasper's frustration bubbled to the surface. "Sam, this is a big deal. You of all people should understand what this means for me." Sam stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I do understand, Jasper. I understand that your career will always come first." The words cut deeper than Jasper expected. He stood as well, his voice rising. "That's not fair, and you know it. This isn't about choosing one over the other. I want you to be part of this." "No, you don't," Sam interrupted, his voice breaking. "You want the dream, the applause, the crowds, and I'm just supposed to wait here like some placeholder." The argument ended abruptly, neither of them willing to say more. Jasper left the club that night without looking back, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in the empty space. For days, the silence between them was deafening. Jasper threw himself into his music, struggling to make sense of the offer and his feelings for Sam. Sam, meanwhile, wrestled with the fear that had always loomed over him. The fear of being left behind, of not being enough to hold someone's attention. But life had one more curve to throw their way. One evening, as Sam was closing up the bar, a familiar figure walked in. It was someone he hadn't seen in years. His ex-partner, Daniel. Daniel's sudden appearance was jarring, stirring up memories Sam had worked hard to bury. Daniel spoke of regrets, of wanting to make amends, but the encounter only deepened Sam's insecurities. It wasn't just the past Daniel represented. It was the fear that Jasper would leave him the same way. Later that week, Jasper returned to the Velvet Note for what he planned to be his last performance, before making a decision about the tour. The room was packed, the usual hum of conversation replaced by a buzz of anticipation. But Jasper wasn't focused on the crowd. His thoughts were entirely on the man standing behind the bar, who had barely glanced his way all evening. As the lights dimmed and the first chords filled the room, something in Jasper's playing shifted. This wasn't just another performance, it was an outpouring of everything he couldn't put into words. The melody was raw, filled with both sorrow and hope, each note carrying the weight of his emotions. Sam stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the bar as he listened. It wasn't just the music, it was the message behind it. The vulnerability Jasper was laying bare in front of an entire room. For the first time, Sam saw past his own fears and into the heart of someone who was fighting just as hard to keep them together. After the set ended and the applause faded, Jasper didn't leave the stage. Instead, he stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've spent my whole life chasing a dream," he began, his eyes locking onto Sam's. "And for a long time, I thought that dream was just about music. But the truth is, my dream changed the moment I met you. I don't want to do this without you, Sam, but I can't do it if you don't believe in me." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jasper stepped down from the stage and made his way to the bar, stopping just in front of Sam. "I'm not going anywhere if it means losing you," Jasper said, his voice soft but firm. "You're part of this now, whether you like it or not." Sam looked at him for a long moment, his emotions warring behind his eyes. And then finally he spoke. "I don't want to hold you back. he said quietly. You're not, Jasper replied, reaching for Sam's hand. You're the reason I want to move forward. For the first time in years, Sam allowed himself to believe it. To believe that love didn't have to mean sacrifice, that it could be something they built together. Jasper stood backstage, his guitar resting against his leg. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, gratitude for the opportunities ahead, sadness for what he was leaving behind, and, most of all, a quiet ache for the man he hoped would be in the audience tonight. But as he peeked through the curtain, scanning the familiar sea of faces, he didn't see Sam. His chest tightened, though he pushed the thought aside. He couldn't blame Sam for staying away. The lights dimmed, and the crowd hushed as Jasper took the stage. He offered the audience a small, grateful smile before beginning his first song. The notes flowed effortlessly, but there was a weight to his playing, a lingering sorrow that colored every melody. It was the sound of goodbye, not just to a place, but to a chapter of his life. Halfway through his set, something happened that made him pause mid-chord. From the corner of his eye, he caught a familiar figure walking through the doors of the club. The murmurs in the crowd quieted as Sam stepped forward, his movements purposeful but calm. He wasn't behind the bar tonight. He was walking toward the stage. Jasper's fingers stilled on the strings as he watched, his heart pounding. Sam climbed the few steps to the stage, a faint but determined smile on his face. In his hands, he carried something Jasper hadn't expected, a sheet of music. Without a word, Sam sat at the piano, his fingers brushing the keys as he adjusted the bench. The room was silent now, every eye on the stage, every breath held. Jasper stared, too stunned to speak, until Sam looked up at him, his expression soft but steady. "Play with me," Sam said simply. Jasper didn't hesitate. He picked up his guitar, his hands finding the strings as if by instinct, and together they began. The duet was unlike anything the audience, or either of them, had ever heard. It wasn't just music, it was a conversation, a declaration, and a promise all at once. Sam's piano lines were tentative at first, but quickly grew bold, weaving around Jasper's guitar in a way that felt natural, inevitable. The melody spoke of reconciliation, of second chances, and of love that had been tested but refused to break. When the final note faded, the room erupted into applause. But for Jasper and Sam, the world outside the stage didn't seem to exist in that moment. Jasper set his guitar aside and crossed the stage to stand beside Sam. "You didn't have to do this," Jasper said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "I did," Sam replied, meeting his gaze. "Because I don't want you to go. I know I've been hard to love, but if you're willing to stay, I want to try." Jasper's response was immediate, his voice unwavering. "I never wanted to leave you, Sam. I just didn't know if you'd ever let me in." Sam smiled then, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. And in front of a room full of strangers and friends, Jasper pulled him into a hug that spoke louder than words ever could. The next few weeks brought changes neither of them could have predicted. Jasper turned down the tour, deciding that his music had always belonged at the Velvet Note, where it had found its truest audience and its truest inspiration. Sam, for his part, began to open himself up in ways he never thought possible. He started sharing more of his past, his fears, and even his long-buried dream of helping musicians like Jasper find their voice. Together, they transformed the Velvet Note from a small jazz club into a renowned hub for aspiring artists. They hosted open mic nights, workshops, and even small festivals that drew talent from all over Los Angeles. The club became more than a venue. It became a community, a place where stories and dreams found their rhythm. The final scene of their story unfolded on a warm Friday night, with the club at full capacity. Jasper had just finished a set, the crowd still buzzing from the energy of his performance. But instead of walking off stage, he reached for the microphone, clearing his throat nervously. "I've always said this place was special," Jasper began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Not because of the music, though that's part of it, but because of the people who make it feel like home." He turned toward the bar where Sam was standing, his arms crossed as he watched with a curious smile. Jasper gestured for him to join him on stage, and though Sam hesitated for a moment, he finally obliged, climbing the steps as the crowd clapped. Jasper reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. The room fell silent as he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Sam," Jasper said, his voice shaking slightly. "You've taught me more about love and music than I ever thought possible. You've shown me what it means to fight for something, even when it's hard. And I don't want to spend another moment of my life without you. Will you marry me?" Sam's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he couldn't speak. But then he nodded, his voice breaking as he said, "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." The audience erupted into cheers and applause, but Jasper and Sam seemed oblivious to the noise. They stood there holding each other, their silhouettes illuminated by the warm glow of the stage lights, and as the sound of a jazz melody filled the room, the two of them stood together, their love now the heartbeat of the Velvet Note, a place where dreams didn't just come true, they thrived. The applause lingered in the air, a symphony of cheers and clinking glasses that seemed to wrap around Jasper and Sam as they stood on the stage. The Velvet Note had never been louder, yet for the two of them the world felt blissfully quiet. Jasper slipped the ring onto Sam's finger, his hands trembling slightly, though one in his gaze was steady and unwavering. Sam, for once, didn't feel the need to hide his emotions. Tears shimmered in his eyes, not from sadness or fear, but from a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. He reached for Jasper's hand, squeezing it tightly as if to anchor himself in the moment. "I didn't think I'd ever find this," Sam said, his voice barely audible over the crowd. "But somehow you make me believe in everything I was afraid to hope for." Jasper's grin widened, his own eyes glistening. "And you make me believe that I'm enough, just as I am. I couldn't have done this without you, Sam." The crowd erupted into another wave of cheers as they embraced, their connection now a beacon for everyone in the room. For a moment, it felt as if the walls of the Velvet Note were holding more than just music. They were holding the beginning of something extraordinary. As the applause began to fade, Jasper picked up the microphone again, addressing the audience with his characteristic charm. "I think we all know I'm the luckiest guy in this room," he said, prompting a ripple of laughter and applause. "But seriously, this club, these people, you've given us more than we could ever put into words. And I promise this isn't the end. There's more music, more stories, and more love to share here at the Velvet Note." Sam, still holding Jasper's hand, stepped up to the microphone. It was rare for him to address the room, but tonight was different. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying a sincerity that made the moment even more poignant. "Thank you for being part of our story." The night didn't end with the proposal. It transformed into a celebration. The band returned to the stage, their music brighter and more joyful than ever. Friends and strangers toasted to Jasper and Sam, the atmosphere buzzing with a kind of joy that felt almost tangible. As the night wore on, the club began to empty, the candles burning low on the tables. Jasper and Sam sat together at the bar, their hands still intertwined. The buzz of excitement had softened, leaving behind a quiet contentment. "I never thought I'd get used to being on stage for something like this," Sam said with a small laugh. "You were perfect," Jasper replied, leaning closer. "Just like I knew you would be." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the evening settling around them. It wasn't just the proposal that had changed everything, it was the realization that their story was just beginning. As the last guest left, one of the regulars called out, "We'll see you both here next week, right?" Jasper nodded, flashing a grin. "Wouldn't miss it." Sam smiled, his heart full in a way he hadn't thought possible. The Velvet Note wasn't just a jazz club anymore. It was the place where they'd built a life. One note, one glance, one promise at a time. As they locked the doors and stepped out into the warm Los Angeles night, Jasper turned to Sam, his voice soft. "So, what do you think we should call our first album?" he teased. Sam laughed, shaking his head. "I think we've got time to figure that out." Love stories like this remind us of the power of connection. If this story touched your heart, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And remember, love always finds its way. We are Pride Stories, unfiltered. Your number one pride.